Hello everyone, this is Mathfinder, the home for every math nerd's Pathfinder optimization needs. If you're new here, welcome, and we're so glad to have you. If you've been here before, welcome back, and thank you so much for continued support. In today's video, I wanted to focus on a pretty narrow aspect of martial optimization discourse, specifically one applicable to strength martials, heavy armor, and its viability, whether it's strictly better than medium armor and light armor or not, and so on. And I think that as we go through this discussion, we will unlock something larger, something of a more overarching point that's applicable to a larger variety of both martial and spellcaster optimization discourse that I will then use in future videos. And we'll get to that near the end of this video. But first, we have to talk about heavy armor and the tendency of people to present it as a strict upgrade over medium armor. Not every class has access to heavy armor, of course. Many martials are just stuck with medium. And I have noticed this tendency where if you're building a class that has access to heavy armor, it's considered almost wasteful to not use heavy armor because you get +1 to AC. Why would you forego that AC when you could be one higher than somebody in medium armor? And I don't think that that makes sense. I think medium armor and heavy armor both have arguments to be used, and you should use the one that suits your character with the rest of your build and the rest of your party's build and the context of your campaign all taken into account. Heavy and medium armor are pretty even in my opinion, and I hope that by the end of this video, I will have convinced you of the same. Before getting into the content of today's video though, let's talk about this video's sponsor. Elderbrain is a company that releases third-party content mostly for D&D 5th edition, but recently they started branching out into Pathfinder 2nd edition. And notably, I directly work with them on converting many of their one-shots over to Pathfinder 2nd edition. Me and the other Pathfinder designers on their team ensured that these don't feel like D&D first with Pathfinder as an afterthought adventures. They're designed and redesigned to feel like real Pathfinder games that fit in context of Pathfinder characters and the sorts of adventures you would expect to run. We were given a pretty good deal of creative liberty to make sure that these would land, and they're full of interesting content. Of course, the actual one-shots themselves, but also magic items, spells, and subclasses. You can use the link in the video description below to go to their website and they'll know that I sent you, and if you use the code Mathfinder at checkout, you will get a discount and I will get a small piece of that commission. To find their Pathfinder 2e content, you're looking for their Mindscape series of one-shots. Notably, within that, I directly worked on 2 of the ones that are currently out. Veils of Lavender and Still It Rises, respectively for the levels 5 to 8 and 1 to 4 ranges. So if you'd like to support a newcoming third-party creator at the scene, as well as directly support me, please go ahead and check out those one-shots, and I promise you, they're very fun. Some of them have some very creative premises. My favorite one is not out yet, but it will probably be in the next few months. Now let's get back to the video. To get started with talking about heavy armor and its trade-offs, let's first establish the baseline of what it even does. Compared to medium armor, what does heavy armor have that's making people even consider whether it's a strict upside or downside? Well, the first thing it gives you is a +1 to your armor class relative to medium armor. So at level 1, where medium armor would have given you 18 AC, heavy would instead give you 19, and this trend holds for all levels, so long as your proficiency stays the same. And then it gives you a -5 to your movement speed. Theoretically, it gives you a -10, but the first 5 of that can be ignored by having sufficient strength, which you really should if you're wearing heavy armor, so functionally it's only giving you a -5. And then the second thing it gives you is Bulwark, a patch-up for your reflex saves to allow you to dump dexterity. We will ignore Bulwark for now though, it'll come back at the end of this video, but for the most of this video we're just going to talk about the +1 to armor class and the -5 to movement speed. Now, the argument for heavy armor being a strict upgrade always goes as follows. +1 to your armor class always matters, whereas a -5 to your speed is circumstantial. It's not going to come up in every combat. And superficially, this argument really does seem like it makes sense because a numerical bonus will always matter, whereas something that changes how you play, like speed, won't always matter. Except, is that really true? Does a +1 to armor class always matter? Because it doesn't. There's exactly 2 ways in which +1 armor class is going to change the result of something happening to you. First, there's option A. If we take a hypothetical version of you that was wearing medium armor, and the exact roll needed to just barely hit your armor class was a 10, 11, 12, or one of the numbers higher than that. If one of those numbers was the exact roll needed to hit you, then a +1 to your armor class changes that roll by exactly 1. If you were previously being hit on a 10, it goes to 11. If it was previously 13, it goes up to 14. That is exactly 1 out of 20 outcomes being changed if that was what your AC was in medium armor. And then option B is where it's 2 out of 20 outcomes. If previously the edge case roll was a natural 9 or lower, now you're changing 2 outcomes on the die. If you were being hit on a natural 9, you were also being crit on a natural 19, and a +1 to your AC changes both the hit and the crit edge case. Now you're being hit on 10 and crit on 20. So in that case, 2 out of 20 outcomes were changed. Now between the two, I think it's fair to say that option A is going to be much more frequent for multiple reasons. If you look only at the first strike a monster makes against you, well, an enemy higher level than you is always going to be an option B, because they're most likely critting you on a number other than 20, which means you're going to change 2 outcomes on the dice. An enemy lower level than you is almost always going to be an option A. And an enemy of exactly the same level is going to be a toss-up. Sometimes they're going to be critting you on a 19, sometimes they're not. And already you can see that that makes option A the more frequent one, because mooks generally show up in multiples, whereas bosses and higher level enemies show up in smaller numbers, which means that the people who do option A will vastly outnumber the people doing option B over your career. And then you should account for the multiple attack penalty. Bosses, even if their first strike almost certainly is going to crit you on something other than a 20, their second and potentially third strikes are not. So even with bosses, you're going to take some option A strikes that are not option B. And this means overall, you're going to take a lot more of option A than you are of option B over the course of your career. So if there were an exactly equal number of option A and option B strikes, one of them has a 5% differential from heavy armor, the other has a 10% differential from heavy armor, then exactly in the middle would be 7.5% if they were equally frequent. But because option A is much more frequent, I think it's fair to say that +1 AC matters against about 6% of attacks you take. Not 7.5, leaning much closer to 5%. And from that, we can extrapolate how often is a +1 AC going to make a difference within the scope of one combat. Let's say that in a combat you ate 5 strikes. Then 6% on each of them means there's a 26.61% chance that at least one strike's outcome was changed over the course of the combat by having been in heavy armor rather than medium. And that seems like a lot. 1 in 4 combats, the +1 AC is going to matter. That is certainly a lot. But then you have to remember, if you were in medium armor instead, it's not like every individual attack you ate is going to matter. Not every attack you take has a 100% chance of making a lethal difference either. If you take a strike and nobody ends up spending a heal spell slot in the middle of combat, that strike most likely didn't matter. It was not in danger of putting you unconscious. If you then get a chance to heal up to full HP after and refocus your party, etc., it certainly didn't matter. And that's not going to happen in every combat. I've spoken before about how it's unfair to assume that parties will always rest, but they will some portion of the time get to rest after a combat and just heal off all the damage they took, and in those cases it won't matter. So I think I'm being pretty generous when I say that the +1 AC is going to matter in about 15% of combats. Remember, in any individual combat, there's about a 75% chance that it won't matter at all. That is, it literally will not change any outcomes. So when I say 15%, I'm saying more than half of the cases where an outcome was even changed are the cases where now it was significant that the outcome was changed, that it stopped somebody from going unconscious, that it actually helped with not being able to heal out of combat later. So I think I'm being pretty generous when I say 15%, which is approximately 1 in 7 combats. So the value of the +1 AC from Heavy Armor is 1 in 7 combats. And that brings us to the important question and the focus of this video. Does the -5 to speed even out the +1 to the armor class? If it does, then heavy and medium armor are equally powerful. If it doesn't, then heavy armor is indeed a strict upgrade. And spoiler alert, in my opinion, absolutely yes it does. There's literally zero question about it, and all of my play experience has confirmed this many times. It was genuinely surprising to me that there even is a debate about whether heavy armor is better than medium or not, and I think I have finally put my finger on why it is. So let's get into it. Remember, just mentally keep a note that the speed is only going to make about as much difference as that 1 in 7 I mentioned on the slide before. If you try to hold your speed up to the impossible standard of making a difference in literally every single combat, it's not going to hold up. But that is not the standard that +1 armor class fills, and that is not the standard that speed should be compared to either. 1 in 7 combats is not a high bar at all, and I would argue that in the combats where speed comes up, where that extra 5 foot mattered, it's likelier to make a difference. So even if you take that previous number where 1 in 4 combats is where that +1 AC comes up, I would definitely agree with you that 1 in 4 combats are not going to be affected by a 5 foot speed penalty. I would say it's closer to 1 in 8 or even 1 in 10. But when it does come up, it is much more likely to make a significant difference in my opinion. Whereas with heavy armor, like we saw, even when it comes up, there are going to be many cases where the damage you took didn't end up making a difference. And that is just good design. The thing that comes up more frequently should make less of a difference when it comes up. The thing that comes up more situationally should dominate the situations where it does come up. And I think speed and armor class kind of have that duality going on. +1 AC will come up more often, matter less often. Speed will come up less often, matter more often, and ultimately I think it's fair to say it will even out to those 1 out of 7 combats. But people really do underrate how relevant speed is, and I have finally put my finger on why. There is a tendency to view it as sort of a straight line. If I am here and the enemy is here and I can get to them in a straight line, I have enough speed and I don't need any more. You'll see this argument all the time. People will say there's really significant diminishing returns on speed, and when taken to an extreme, this is actually used as a disparagement of ranged characters, as I linked above, because there's a tendency to view that speed and reaching an enemy in a straight line only at the beginning of combat is all movement is about. And if you boil movement down to this bare bones simplicity, ranged characters are basically irrelevant. But movement is not that simple, and even if we take it out of the extreme case, this is not the only way for speed to matter. So the images below are the visualization of this linear speed. Valeros is 25 feet away from a zombie in the left image and 30 feet away from a zombie in the right image. 25 feet is the speed that you would have as a human if you had heavy armor and the fleet feet. 30 is what you would have with medium armor and the fleet feet. And this 5 foot difference is making enough of a difference that in the left image, Valeros will take stride, and then strike the enemy, and in the right image, he would go stride and then strike twice. We are, of course, ignoring feats like sudden charge for now. They will matter later in the video. And when you view this as the one and only thing speed does for you, of course you're going to underrate speed. How many instances have you had where you were literally just 5 feet away from an enemy because of heavy armor? I would imagine it's not that frequent, but that is not the only use for speed. This is the start of the conversation, and the people who underrate speed usually treat this as the end of the conversation. So I propose a new way of looking at speed, what I like to call reachability. On the previous slide, we were effectively asking this question of our movement. Can I reach an enemy, one single enemy. No matter how many enemies there are around me, no matter what the terrain looks like, no matter what the circumstances look like, no matter what my party looks like, if I can reach one enemy, I have enough speed. And that is a very restrictive way of looking at what speed does for you. Instead, you should ask yourself this question: what are all of the squares I can reach from where I currently am? And the moment you start asking yourself this question, instead of looking at if you can reach one singular enemy, yes or no, you will suddenly start to see the value of movement much, much more clearly. So this is a visualization of the reachability idea on a completely open featureless field. So there's nothing blocking you from moving your whole movement. The images below, on the left, there's a 25-foot movement speed, which can reach 89 different squares. Whereas on the right, it's a 30-foot movement speed that's able to reach 120 different squares, 31 more squares, almost 1.4 times as much. And now, I'm not trying to trick you. Obviously, not every single one of those 31 squares is going to matter. Most of the time, you can't just reach every single one of them. There's going to be obstacles, there's going to be enemies, and even when you can reach them, not every square is something you care to reach for, right? But my point here isn't to white room speed. I will get into real scenarios. My point here is just to get a high-level illustration to explain that movement isn't just about striding to one enemy. It's much more than that. And once you start looking at the sum total of your reachability, we can enter the next stage of this conversation: the actual tactical advantages of being able to reach a huge number of squares with your movement. The way I'm going to show this is I'm going to bring up point by point these advantages, and this is not an exhaustive list, and then I will show a clear visual of those advantages. So the first one is flanking when you otherwise couldn't. This is probably the simplest of the advantages. And this is something that kind of on its own disproves the whole idea that you need to be able to just linearly get to an enemy. Because look at this image. It's the same one as before. There's a zombie 25 feet away from Valeros. Valeros is still able to get to the zombie and make a strike. But once you account for the fact that Marisol, the rogue, really wants him flanking with her and doesn't have gang up yet, then those extra 5 feet are going to matter. If Valeros only has 25 feet of movement, that means no accuracy boost for Valeros, no accuracy boost for Marisol, and no sneak attack for Marisol. So simply the nature of your party and who is going early in initiative and who is positioned where to start with can change the square you wish to be in when you can attack an enemy. Even when all you're doing is getting to an enemy to strike them, the exact square you strike them from still does matter. And there can be more complex cases of this too. Here is Marisol trying to flank with an enemy where Valeros could get into flanking with 30 feet of movement, but he needs 40 feet of movement if he wants to get into the flanking position without eating a reactive strike. That is another factor that people don't really talk about. Even if you can get into flanking, being able to get there in the most optimal way matters. So both of these images really start to show why that "can I get to an enemy in a straight line or not" question is so incomplete and misleading. Yes, that is one way movement might matter, but that's not the only way. The left image shows that just because you can get to an enemy doesn't mean that you can get to the square you want to be when you strike that enemy. The right image shows that even if you can get to the square you want to be in to strike that enemy, sometimes it matters what squares you occupied along the way. That is why every 5-foot increment of speed matters, and this is just one of the advantages. The next advantage to talk about is target prioritization. This is something I talked about in my ranged versus melee video, where ranged characters just have better target priority. And that is true, ranged characters always have better target priority than melee ones, but melee ones with a high speed certainly have it better than melee ones with a low speed. Here is a visual of Valeros the fighter, but this time with Ezran the wizard. Ezran wants to fireball this room full of goblins. If Valeros has a 25-foot movement speed, he can get to any of the 4 goblins in the north half of this room. If he had a 30-foot movement speed, he would be able to get to all of the goblins, any of the goblins that he wanted to. And I talked about this in my Blaster Caster video as well. One of the advantages of blasting is that when you throw out a huge AoE, you can just hope that 1 or 2 of them fail or crit fail, and then your martial characters can go and focus those ones down and take them out of the action economy quickly, thereby immediately making the encounter easier. In the left image, if somebody on the southwest is the main target priority after the fireball for Valeros, he can't get to them efficiently. In the image on the right, he can. And again, in this specific context, you might say, if we're just trying to target people who failed or crit failed, does it really matter if you stride twice instead of stride once? You're probably going to drop them in one shot anyways, right? Yeah, it does matter, because what happens in the case where both of the enemies in the bottom left failed or crit failed? Valeros on the right is able to strike once on one of them, and then strike once on the other if the first one drops. Valeros on the left is only going to get 1 strike if he makes 2 strides to get there. No matter how you look at it, the fact is that having 1 stride versus 2 strides is an action economy booster. It is going to bring you more actions, and even in the cases where it doesn't bring you as much in terms of vertical action boosts, it will still get you more action flexibility. And this action flexibility argument will come back when I talk about sudden charge. We're ignoring sudden charge for now and just looking at basic actions. The next advantage I wanted to talk about is avoiding hazards, hazardous terrain, or obstacles. Really just interacting with terrain in general. This first image shows a 15-foot by 20-foot fiery hazard. Somebody with a 40 or 45-foot movement speed is able to go around this hazard and get to their foe and still make strikes. A melee character that did not have at least 40 foot of movement speed would have to go straight through the hazard. And you'll notice this is a different 5-foot increment than the 25 versus 30 I've been using in many of my previous examples. This is intentional and will come back near the end of this video when I talk about things like Tailwind. But the point here is that every 5-foot increment of speed will matter in some or the other cases. 25 versus 30 mattered on some of those maps I drew earlier. 35 versus 40 matters in this case. Even the 5-foot increment you approach when you nearly double the base speed of a heavy armor user still mattered. And here is another illustration. Rather than a hazard, now we're using, say, a wall of stone as an example. If the caster on the right has put a wall that stops Valeros from getting to the caster and attacking them, and or supporting their party members on this side of the wall, Valeros now needs 85 feet of movement to get to that caster. And 85 means now we're in the territory of 2 strides for a 45-foot movement speed character. For somebody with any less than 45, you're not getting there in 2 strides, you need 3 total. And at this point, even the argument for feats like sudden charge will not be enough, because somebody with less than 45 feet of movement will need to first take 1 stride and then sudden charge to take that strike at the enemy, whereas Valeros with 45 feet of movement can just sudden charge once and then have an action left over. And I think at this point, with all of these examples, I have kind of sufficiently illustrated that every 5-foot increment really does matter in some or the other cases. And then we get to the final tactical advantage I wanted to talk about. And this is one that slightly peeves me when it gets ignored, because so many of the people who insist that you don't really need more than like 30 feet of movement, so heavy armor is not really a downside at all, are just kind of ignoring this incredibly common thing that's going to come up all the damn time in any game of Pathfinder. Difficult terrain or losing actions in any way, like being slowed or stunned in some capacity. You don't always have your full 3 actions. You don't always get to use your full speed. This is what a 25-foot movement speed looks like in difficult terrain, because you have it, and then you round down. A kind GM might allow you to string together stride actions because there are vague rules for that, where you will say combined stride 50 feet rather than striding once for 25, and then you will manage to get your 25 feet of movement. And if the GM doesn't allow that, then 2 actions will give you 20 feet of movement. In this example, if we're doing the round down thing, Valeros can only barely get to the spider. Were he one more space away, he actually just would not be able to get to the spider without using all 3 of his actions. And that is assuming he even has all 3 of his actions. If you're slowed, then every stride you spend becomes that much more expensive. Every action compression option you wish to use, like sudden charge, becomes that much harder to sequence, and every single one of those things matters. So the argument that 5-foot increments of speed stop mattering somewhere in the 30 to 35 mark really does not make sense. It doesn't even make sense at a baseline, because it's assuming that you just want to get to an enemy and attack them. But so many things can matter in that case. The exact enemy you're choosing to attack, the exact square you choose to attack that enemy from, the obstacles and or hazards you have to navigate to get to them, and then fourth and the most ignored, the question of whether you even have enough actions to get to them, and how often is it going to be that your extra 5 foot of speed makes a difference in how many actions you get. It's going to make that difference. And it's really important to note here, all of these challenges compound with one another. If you take difficult terrain and add it to one of the previous challenges, movement speed becomes that much more crucial. With compounding, we will start reaching a point where, like, actually having a swashbuckler's or monk's speed becomes really important, because, like, every single 5 foot increment in that 50 foot speed matters. And it's not just difficult terrain that compounds with them. If you need to get to an enemy to focus fire them after a fireball and wish to open a flank, it's very likely multiple 5 foot increments of your speed are mattering along the way. If an enemy has put up obstacles along the way and multiple melee party members are navigating them, or multiple spellcasters are trying to get around them, it's again going to matter every 5 foot increment along the way. If you need to get into a position where you set up the best possible reaction, that 5 foot is going to make a difference of whether your champion is able to give a resistance to an ally or not, because they're only 15 feet from their ally and say not from an enemy because they were not able to go that extra 5 foot distance. Once you start looking at reachability rather than just the linear can I get to an enemy or not question, every 5 foot increment of speed is going to matter. And now I want to address some of the most common counter-arguments I see to the speed penalty being a big deal. The first, and in my opinion most irrelevant one, is, well, it's just 5 feet. You can just pick up Fleet and second rank Tailwind and that gives you plus 15. And that's more than -5, so it doesn't matter. This is genuinely a pretty silly argument in my opinion, because those stack with medium armor too. Like, a medium armor character can use the exact same amount of general feats and skill feats to get the exact same speed bonus. No matter how you look at it, the medium armor character is going to be 5 foot ahead of you. This argument literally only makes sense because people are comparing a medium armor character who doesn't have these things to a heavy armor character who does, which is, why are we doing that comparison at all? That's not a meaningful comparison. Every 5 foot increment matters. And notably, this is why many of my examples used a breakpoint that wasn't just 25 versus 30. If you take a heavy armor character, give them Fleet and Tailwind, they'll be at 35 feet. If they were in medium armor, they would have been at 40 feet. And even that one example that went 40 versus 45 feet, you can take both of these characters and then give them, say, a Boots of Bounding, and all my arguments still hold. No matter how you look at it, every single 5 foot increment mattered, and it mattered in a way that wasn't GM contrivance. The GM didn't have to specifically reward, like, the high movement speeds with a big map or highly mobile enemies or anything. These were standard enemies in very normally sized maps, both indoors and outdoors, and every 5 foot increment of speed matters in really normal circumstances. Like, normal circumstances like my friend wants to flank with me, or my friend threw a fireball, or there's some difficult terrain in front of me. The most contrived circumstance I used was the hazards and walls example, and again, that's not that contrived. Those things are just a good strategy for NPCs to use against players. The next argument I see most commonly used is that you can ignore this downside with a mount or with Dawn Silver armor. And the only answer to this is that everything has an opportunity cost. Heavy armor, its +1 AC, has the opportunity cost of going down on speed. Going back up on speed now has the opportunity cost of either getting that mount or getting that Dawn Silver armor. There's nothing wrong with that. If you paid an opportunity cost here, you can pay a cost elsewhere to nullify this one. That doesn't make heavy armor a strict upgrade. That just means you traded opportunity cost for opportunity cost. Mounts are going to cost you feats if you wish to upgrade them. A minimum of 2, in my opinion, so you can make use of Mature Animal Companion. And they're going to permanently debuff your reflex save. And they make you softer to AoEs, because multi-target effects and AoE effects, especially the ones that somehow control or debuff your movement, are going to have double the opportunity of impacting your turns and making you worse off. And of course, mounts suck indoors, and in a 5-foot hallway, a large mount is actually traveling at half speed. None of this is to say mounts are universally bad. Mounts are fantastic, and they're a great way to get around the heavy armor penalty. But they have an opportunity cost. Likewise, Dawn Silver is just going to cost a huge chunk of gold. It also locks you out of other precious materials, most notably adamantine. And it will temporarily lock you out of runes. Once you have standard grade Dawn Silver, you can't get high grade Dawn Silver until level 19, which means until level 19, you're not getting your +3 armor runes or your major resilient armor runes. So again, Dawn Silver, despite being an effective way of reducing that speed penalty to 0, is still going to have an opportunity cost. And finally, and this is the one that deserves the most scrutiny, gap closer feeds like Sudden Charge supposedly nullify the downside entirely. And this, more so than any of the other counterarguments, looks superficially correct. This is because Sudden Charge is literally 3 for 2 actions. So let's take all of the arguments I made on the previous slides. Effectively, all you're boiling them down to is a 2 for 1 action trade. Instead of 2 strides, I needed 1 stride, right? And Sudden Charge, by being a 3 for 2, completely evens it out. And then it shifts the conversation not to 20 to 25, 40 to 45 increments of speed, but to 80 to 85 increments of speed. You'll notice that on all of my previous examples, the only one where explicitly Sudden Charge was going to lag behind in actions behind just a high speed was when there was a wall of stone and Valeros needed 85 feet of movement to get to the enemy. So if you believe this argument at face value, the speed penalty won't end up mattering until the 80s in movement speed. And that is a crazy amount of distance to matter. So you're not going to feel like every 5-foot increment matters. But I think this is only superficially true. You're only mitigating the downside. It still exists. You are mitigating the action quantity downside, but you're not mitigating the action quality. Compare the following examples. Sudden Charge, making a strike at the end of that movement and then making a trip, versus striding in, making a trip and then making a strike, or striding in and then just using Slam Down. The latter two, where you didn't need to use Sudden Charge, simply are better. They are a better action quality. Sudden Charge locked you into a strike. You couldn't do a trip as your first thing. And yes, you can optionally just not make the strike, but at that point you're not making a 3 for 2 action trade. You're actually just doing stride, stride, trip if you skip the strike, which means you're way behind what you would have gotten with a higher movement speed. So Sudden Charge is going to force you to mitigate one of the downsides of not having the right movement speed, either the action quantity or the action quality, but you will never get to erase both of them. Here's another example. Sudden Charge, strike into combat grab versus having the option of just striding up, tripping, and then using combat grab. Remember, if doing the strike first rather than a trip is better, the person on the right still just has the option to do so. They can just choose to do that if they would like. But they also have the option to do a strike and then a combat grab, an option Sudden Charge will never receive. Here's another one. Sudden Charge, strike into another strike, versus striding in and just using double slice, not having the multiple attack penalty on that second strike. And of course, this ignores the fact that the Sudden Charge has a flourish trait, once you also account for that, it really, really restricts your action quality. It might lock you out of useful options like, say, Vicious Swing to get a particularly low health enemy or bypassing a resistance, or Doctor's Visitation if you have it via the medic dedication, which, as I talked about in my Stop Building Boring Marshals video, is something a lot of marshals should consider for variety. Literally, no matter how you look at it, Sudden Charge will still have a downside. It is not completely erasing the downside of not having had enough speed. And of course, there are going to also be cases where you having the extra 5-foot speed meant that in terms of Sudden Charge, you had an extra 10-foot, which is going to make a difference too. There are going to be cases like the Wall of Stone example where the Sudden Charge of a high movement speed character gets you somewhere where the Sudden Charge of a lower movement speed character doesn't quite get you there. So literally, no matter how you look at it, every 5-foot increment of speed matters, and no individual thing you purchase for some opportunity cost erases that. You either pay heftily to erase that, or you pay softly, but then only mitigate that. You don't erase the downside. And finally, we should address the elephant in the room, that is the Bulwark trait. Thus far, I have been assuming that Heavy Armor is just +1 AC, -5 speed. A little bit of upside, a little bit of downside, and I have more than sufficiently shown that they are roughly equivalent. But obviously, Bulwark is an additional thing that Heavy Armor gets that also sometimes gets touted as being an upgrade over simply having Dex. But in my opinion, Bulwark is more of a side grade, not an upgrade. It only appears to be an upgrade when you compare it against the hypothetical of having 0 Dex and not having done anything else with those attribute investments. But once you just compare a fully fleshed out Heavy Armor character to a fully fleshed out Medium Armor character, it's very clear that Bulwark is just a side grade. All Bulwark really says is, effectively, your dexterity is going to be +3 when doing a reflex save against damaging effects. And in every other circumstance, it's just going to be whatever you set it to be. Maybe it's +1, maybe it's just a 0, maybe it's -1. And I think people really overrate how good Bulwark is because it's sometimes hard to visualize that you're not actually that good at reflex saves despite this +3. Think about it. Any character who is invested in dexterity is going to overtake you defensively. Fully invested dexterity marshals, like say a melee swashbuckler or a thief rogue, or practically any ranged marshal, is going to start at a +4 dexterity, and they're going to end at a +7. This means they're significantly ahead of you for every single level range. Right at level 1, they're 1 ahead of you against damaging effects, and potentially 4 ahead of you for every other type of effect. And then by level 20, they're 3 ahead of you for damaging effects and 7 ahead of you for non-damaging ones, assuming you kept your dexterity dumped. I don't think it's really even close. Dexterity marshals are just going to be significantly ahead of you in terms of their reflex saves. Medium armor marshals are also going to be slightly ahead of you. At level 1, they're probably going to start around a +2, maybe +1, likely +2, and they're going to end by a +4 almost for sure. Having +1 or +2 points of real dexterity at level 1 is better than having +3 points of dexterity just against damaging effects, because reflex saves against non-damaging effects do happen, and they do matter. They can matter for some really important things, which we'll get into later. And by level 20, it's very clear that you're just ahead, because at level 20, you're +4 dexterity against all kinds of effects, damaging and non-damaging. And finally, spellcasters, clothcasters specifically, are often going to start at +3 dexterity and attempt to end by level 20 at +5. That being said, their reflex saves are almost certainly going to be behind a Heavy Armor Marshal's in terms of proficiency, which means overall it will end up as a tie. You are 2 ahead defensively, but your proficiency got 2 behind over those same level ranges. But even then, the caster is applying it to non-damaging effects too, and you're not. I think this really illustrates how good it is to have real dex over just using Bulwark. Even the caster who mathematically isn't even able to overtake you consistently, for many level ranges they might be 1 behind, they're still actually better than you at reflex saves simply because their dexterity applies to everything, not just damaging effects. And if you counter that by saying that sure, the Heavy Armor Marshal can also have 1 or 2 points of dex, that has an opportunity cost to it, and if you do so, you have to ask yourself the question, why am I even using a Bulwark trait armor? Because the marginal utility of Bulwark is now much lower for me, and that +1 AC, -5 speed trade-off was already a pretty even trade-off. So if you're investing in dex, it becomes less and less worth it to wear heavy armor. And remember, dexterity is not just reflex saves. Bulwark only applies to reflex saves and only a subset of them, but dexterity applies to a whole lot of other things. Acrobatics is a useful skill in many campaigns that dexterity keys off of. Thievery is going to be a fantastic, borderline mandatory skill if your campaign makes heavy uses of locks and hazards in some capacity. And of course, there's stealth, a skill any character, be it caster or martial, is allowed to use simply to improve their initiative, and they can just do that unconditionally in every single campaign that has any kind of combats whatsoever. So having actual factual dexterity has its own upsides, and thus going for Bulwark helps you patch up for some of those lack of upsides that you would otherwise have been getting from dexterity, but not all of them. Dexterity is one of the more powerful stats in the game. If you are a heavy armor marshal who decided to forego dexterity in favor of enabling charisma, for example, you're going to feel that lack of dexterity even with your Bulwark trait. Your skills are not going to be as impactful in a lot of cases. You're not going to go early in combat as often, and there's even going to be non-damaging effects that bypass your Bulwark and feel bad sometimes. You'll feel like you have a -3 to your save. Now, damaging effects is a bit of a toss-up. I am going to talk a little bit about my opinion and also talk about what I think the general trend is. Every single GM is going to let you apply Bulwark against Fireball. Anything that is just like do basic save for damage, you're fine, Bulwark will apply. And that's where Bulwark is designed to shine. There are some unclear cases, like Trip or Swallow Whole. Trip does a bit of damage on a critical success. Swallow Whole does a bit of damage, but notably, the save you make is not to avoid the damage. It's to avoid being swallowed, and then being swallowed is what does the damage to you. These cases are unclear. Most GMs that I have talked to will not allow Bulwark to give you an effective +3 against Trip or Swallow Whole. If your GM allows it, Bulwark is going to be a lot better at your tables than at most other tables that I have interacted with. So that's something to keep in mind. The optimality of Bulwark changes depending on how the ambiguity of this rule is interpreted. But there are still plenty of unambiguous no cases. Notably, most immobilizing effects, like say the Entangling Flora spell, do not have any damage attached to them. They simply will bypass Bulwark. And one really important thing that everyone kind of ignores is Tumble Through. If you are trying to protect your party and an enemy tries to tumble through you, Bulwark does nothing against that. And as a heavily armored tank, that is a big deal. I have played Guardian characters where the deciding factor for me not choosing heavy armor was the fact that I didn't want to be tumbled through. I wanted to have actual dexterity that keeps my reflex up to avoid being tumbled through. And that is a downside of Bulwark. Ultimately, Bulwark is simply a side grade that's going to save you dexterity investment. It's not an upgrade. It is not just a way to not feel any of the downsides of dexterity. Even if you have Bulwark, there are going to be reflex saves it doesn't apply to. Even if you're playing at a table where the GM allows it to apply to reflex saves like Trip and Swallow Whole, it's still not going to give you the other benefits of dexterity, which is just a fantastic stat. I mean, even thinking about it, switching to a backup weapon with dexterity is also an upside of having some dexterity. And choosing to dump it and hoping that heavy armor patches up your defenses is not going to help you with that backup weapon. You might have to take, say, a caster archetype or something to make ranged attacks with your charisma or wisdom or intelligence. And even if you take improved Bulwark into the consideration, this is a very high level feat, and most heavy armor marshals will need to archetype to access it. Literally, no matter how you look at it, Bulwark is a side grade. It can patch up a lack of dexterity investment. It does not fully negate that. It has a real opportunity cost, and if you invest deeper into it to bypass that opportunity cost, get a caster dedication for ranged poke, get improved Bulwark, you're actually increasing its opportunity cost to patch up its weaknesses, which ultimately evens out in the end. Bulwark is, in my opinion, a net zero trait for that reason. Not an upgrade, just a side grade. Now, every time I make an argument like this, people's immediate next question is, so is the thing just bad? Is heavy armor just bad? Should we just not use it? Nope, not the case. All of those downside mitigating things I mentioned, like Bulwark itself and on the slide before where the counter-arguments against the speed penalty were being used, these things are still pretty damn good. They do help. Heavy armor is good despite its weaknesses. It just has those weaknesses. The extra AC does matter. It is going to come up, and like I said, it's going to come up about as often as you would expect the speed penalty to come up after all the downside mitigation. The ability to not prioritize decks also opens up build variety for characters who need it. The attribute system sort of fundamentally limits build variety, and heavy armor providing Bulwark actually is a really good thing for the game's build variety. I actually wish that we had something similar to Bulwark for will saves and con saves so that some builds could prioritize dumping one of those stats to then open up variety in other areas. It would really help allow for the use of intelligence or charisma as secondary abilities. Frankly, it would be foolish to suggest that heavy armor just sucks. Heavy armor is good. It's just about as good as medium armor, all things considered. It's just not a strict upgrade over medium. That's all I'm trying to argue against. And I feel like this is one of the reasons this conversation often goes in circles, because it often starts with somebody saying, heavy armor is strictly better. And I'm like, no, medium is as good. And then it goes back to, well, you're wrong because heavy armor is not bad. And I'm like, I never said it's bad. It is just about as good as medium. Even if you natively get heavy armor, there are still real reasons to consider medium armor. Like I mentioned on the previous slide, when I built a Guardian, I was 95% of the way convinced that heavy armor was right for my character until I realized that to be an effective tank, I don't want to be able to tumble through. And that is what made me drop heavy armor and go back down to medium. And if you don't natively get heavy, then using feats to obtain it is a worthwhile investment, but it is an expensive investment. You either have to spend one of your 5 general feats ever to get it, or you have to get champion dedication, which then 1 actually costs a class feat, and 2 locks you out of other archetypes until you get out of it. And while it will give you good feats to get out of it, like Champion's Reaction is a fantastic feat to have on any heavily armored character, the point is still you have now invested 3 class feats and a whole bunch of strength and charisma to get to this point. It's not without its costs, even if you ultimately think it's a worthwhile investment. My point here is that almost all things in Pathfinder 2nd Edition that are part of a reasonable build tend to be powerful with a but. The but is often an opportunity cost. Something else is going to be missing. When you're in heavy armor, you will miss the speed. When you're in medium armor, you might miss the charisma you might have otherwise had if you hadn't invested in dex. Every powerful thing, you're going to feel its opportunity cost. And in turn, because there's an opportunity cost, no matter how good you think it is, no matter how good you think, say, heavy armor is, somebody who picked the alternative, medium armor, is not going to feel like it was a mandatory choice. That is sort of the beauty of a well-balanced game. People have this tendency of just forgetting the opportunity costs they paid along the way, and then just thinking about the final destination in kind of a purely numerical sense. And that inflates the value of things like heavy armor. But at the end of the day, because those opportunity costs exist, these things are not mandatory. And these costs aren't theoretical. They are actually going to be felt at the table. I have played characters that, while they were in medium armor, wished they had heavy armor. I have played characters that, while they were in heavy armor, wished they had medium armor. It really is going to go both ways in plenty of practical cases. And all of this talk about opportunity cost makes me question something. Something that's a broader point about Pathfinder 2nd Edition optimization. Why is it so easy for people to ignore opportunity cost when it comes to over-centralizing on something numerical, something that's a flat numerical upgrade, like heavy armor or exemplar dedication or something else? Why is it so easy? Well, it's due to something that I have recently started calling the always-on fallacy. There's this truism in Pathfinder optimization discourse that just gets restated virtually all the time. Even people who disagree with the conclusions you're coming to about optimization are still often going to grant you this premise of this fallacy. That is, that a passive numerical bonus is always going to matter. When you get heavy armor, you always have a +1, so it always matters. Or when you get exemplar dedication with Victor's Wreath or Mirrored Ages or one of the damage upgrading icons, the boost you get from that always matters, making it the highest value dedication. But, as we saw, this is only superficially true. The bonus does not actually always matter, it only appears to. In practice, it has a frequency of how often it will come up. And in fact, in some ways, a passive bonus is worse than an active one because you have no control over the frequency of how often it comes up. The heavy armor versus speed comparison makes this obvious. You have no control over how often the +1 AC from heavy armor is going to make something miss. You do have control over using your speed though. You and your party can set up situations where your speed is really big. For example, if you have a swashbuckler or monk in the party, the caster can feel free to throw out difficult terrain or even greater difficult terrain, knowing that they're not inconveniencing the frontline marshal at all. So I would actually argue that not only is this fallacy wrong, it's actually inverted. Passive, always-on bonuses give you less agency for how often they matter, and thus are actually less reliable. That's probably why they're so frequent. Like, yes, a 5-foot bonus to speed is going to matter less often than just the +1 to armor class, because again, the +1 to armor class is going to matter in 1 out of 4 combats, but you have no control over whether that 1 in 4 combats, that +1 to armor class changed a meaningful hit into a miss. Whereas with speed, you have exact control over what you did when it mattered, and you even have enough control to try and manufacture the situation where it matters. And I think talking about this control sort of unlocks where the always-on fallacy even comes from. Optimization discourse in 2nd edition has its roots and DNA in 1st edition Pathfinder, and of course in D&D 5th edition, because a lot of players who play 2nd edition Pathfinder today came from D&D 5th edition, including myself. Now, I am not very familiar with 1st edition Pathfinder, but I do know the old joke that rolling the d20 in that game was never about seeing if you hit or miss, it was about seeing what you would have to use from your character sheet to then hit, even if you were rolling like a natural 2. Numbers in that game do get crazy high if you know how to optimize. And in 5e, the numbers don't get as high, at least superficially, but it is still possible to get your numbers so high in a relative sense that you're still invalidating the math. Somebody with expertise in athletics is able to very, very consistently grapple enemies, even on like a natural 1 or 2. Somebody who invests deeply into AC, like an Armor Artificer or a Blade Singer, especially if they also get access to the shield spell, is just going to have nearly unhittable AC. And here's the thing, when you can stack your math sky high to the point that you're invalidating the math, then every point of investment mattered. If you're playing a game where, say, getting your math to an effective +6 or so makes you invalidatingly good at the thing you invested in, then every single +1 you took along the way to that +6 mattered. Because even being at a +5 rather than a +6 means you're just good at a thing instead of invalidatingly good at a thing. There is a major difference there. So when you can stack your math to break the math, the always-on fallacy is true. But when you play a game like Pathfinder 2nd edition, where the math simply does not let you stack itself that high, not every point is always on. Every single point you invest has a frequency for how often it's going to matter, and then most of the time it's not going to matter, just like any situational option you would have taken in its stead. So let's talk about another major example, the exemplar dedication, the big boogeyman of the always-on fallacy, the one dedication that the optimization community won't stop talking about. Let's use Victor's Wreath as our benchmark. I largely consider Victor's Wreath to be superior to just one of the damaging icons, unless the damaging icon is a build enabler, like say Shadow Sheath for a throwing marshal, but that's separate. A +1 to attacks matters probably about as often as we identified for the +1 to AC. It's going to be on about 6% of the time on any individual strike, which means over the course of the many strikes you take over the combat, there is a 1 in 4-ish chance that it is going to change one or more of the outcomes. Let's say it's closer to 1 in 3 for mattering because it's not just your strike, it's also affecting the strikes of some allies near you. This is good. It's obviously a good use of a dedication feat. Let's compare it to some other dedications. A spellcaster dedication, like say Druid, can give you Frostbite plus Glass Shield. Let's say if you're a two-handed or dual-wielding martial who can't carry a shield or a buckler, Glass Shield is just a good defensive option to have for the cases where you need it. And Frostbite is a fantastic ranged poke option to have, and then later you can upgrade it to a focus spell if the cantrip damage is not enough. So if we assume that Victor's Wreaths +1 is going to matter 1 in 3 combats, I would say you're probably using one or both of Frostbite or Glass Shield in 1 in 3 combats. And again, unlike Victor's Wreath, you can manufacture situations where it's good to be doing so. You, for example, can coordinate with your party and be like, if y'all cast buff spells, I'll just Frostbite from a distance, force the enemy to close to us, and make a huge tempo difference for your party. Here's another example. Some dedications give you an expert skill increase and or some other nice utility. One of the biggest examples of this is Wrestler dedication. Getting expert athletics immediately frees up another skill increase, and it gives you Titan Wrestler, which is of course fantastic if you're taking the Wrestler dedication, and frees up another skill feat for you. So if you plan to do any athletics maneuvers, Wrestler is just now tied with Exemplar dedication because, yeah, the expert athletics and the other skill you can now pick up expert in because you didn't have to invest in athletics is going to matter probably close to 1 in 3 times already. And on top of that, you got Titan Wrestler, which is going to matter in some number of combats, even if they're rare. And that's just 2 dedications I thought of off the top of my head. There are plenty of dedications that give you good value for what you invest in them. So I really do think dedications give you more than people give them credit for. I'm not saying all dedications are good. I am just saying there are enough good dedications that Exemplar is not just an auto-include. I have seen people say Exemplar archetype is so good that even casters should be taking it for either Victor's Wreath or Mirrored Aegis. I don't really agree with that at all. I have GM'd for a spellcaster who has the Victor's Wreath, and it's good. It's not always on. Allies are not always within her emanation for Victor's Wreath, especially if they're trying to get into clever positions for things like flanking or other utility from their own movement, and she herself is not making that many attack rolls to make this feel always on. It is a nice dedication to have. There are other dedications that are also worth having. And here's the other thing. Even if you come to the conclusion that Exemplar dedication with Victor's Wreath matters more than any other dedication you could possibly pick, which I think is just a dubious conclusion to come to, do you have 2 good feats to gain later? If not, then unless you specifically used multi-talented, you are now locked out of other good archetypes. This can be a big deal. If you're a caster going into Exemplar dedication, for example, you're now locked out of having Beastmaster plus a mature animal companion. You're locked out of picking up another archetype that gives you a useful focus spell. And if you're a martial, there are still other archetypes you might want to get into. Like, what if you wanted commander archetype for a little bit of variety? What if you wanted medic archetype? What if you wanted any of the archetypes I talked about in my Stop Building Boring Martials video? You're locked out of all of them if all you do is pick Exemplar dedication in a non-free archetype game, and even in a free archetype game, you're delaying it to a much higher level. As is the case with Heavy Armor. People who think Exemplar dedication is the mandatory always-on good dedication are just ignoring its opportunity cost. There are other things you could have picked in its place that would have mattered, either as often or less frequently, but with more agency and impact. And it goes beyond Heavy Armor and Exemplar dedication. The next time you see someone just praise an over-centralized numerical bonus option, just ask yourself, is this bonus actually always on? Or does the person think it's always on because they're used to optimizing in other games where every single bonus matters until the point where you invalidate the math? Because that's not how Pathfinder 2nd Edition works. Every single bonus only matters up to a certain point, and the collective of them might matter a lot, but because you're not invalidating the math, the opportunity cost always matters. That'll be it for today's video, folks. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope I've convinced some of you that medium armor is actually worth it. Heavy armor is not this strict upgrade that it's often made out to be. Heavy armor is a powerful tool. As with all powerful tools, in Pathfinder, it comes with an opportunity cost. Invest in it, but recognize its downsides. Invest in its alternatives and recognize their downsides. And once you do so, you will both become better at Pathfinder optimization and feel less bored by it, because you will realize that a lot of things you thought were mandatory for being numerical bonuses aren't actually mandatory. Pathfinder 2nd Edition is actually really cleverly designed in this regard. There is this tendency to view math-boosting feats as being strictly superior to something that doesn't boost your math. But that's not actually true one-to-one. That is only true when there are enough math boosts available that stacking all of them up is the objectively right choice, worth every single cost you paid along the way. When there's just not that many of them, the existence of one or two cannot be problematic, because those then have to actually pay and feel the opportunity cost of the thing they're being traded with. That is it for today's video, folks. If you enjoyed it, please like and comment. Boosting engagement always helps the channel. If you'd like to see my future videos, please subscribe and press the channel notifications button. And of course, if you'd like to directly support me, consider joining a channel membership or making a purchase at the sponsor of this video linked below so I get a commission from it. Regardless, I'll see y'all next time. Mathfinder out.